General Marcus Thompson stepped off the military aircraft at Buckingham Palace's private airfield, his chest decorated with countless medals that caught the morning sunlight. At 52 years old, he was America's most decorated four-star general, a man who had commanded respect on battlefields across 3 continents. His reputation preceded him wherever he went, and today was no different. The invitation to meet with the British royal family had arrived 3 weeks earlier, sealed with the official crest and written on the finest paper Thompson had ever seen. It was an honor reserved for only the most distinguished military leaders, and Thompson felt the weight of representing not just himself, but the entire United States military establishment. As his polished black shoes touched British soil, Thompson straightened his uniform one final time. Every crease was perfect, every button gleaming, every ribbon placed with mathematical precision. His aide, Lieutenant Colonel Davis, walked 2 steps behind, carrying the ceremonial gifts they had brought from America, a collection that included a piece of steel from the World Trade Center Memorial and a flag that had flown over the Pentagon. The imbiteur drive to the palace took them through London's bustling streets, where ordinary citizens went about their daily lives, unaware that one of America's most powerful military figures was passing by their shops and cafes. Thompson gazed out the window, noting the historic buildings and the seamless blend of ancient architecture with modern life. He had visited London before, but never under such prestigious circumstances. Upon arriving at the palace gates, Thompson was struck by the sheer grandeur of the place. The golden gates, the perfectly manicured gardens, and the imposing facade of the building itself seemed to whisper stories of centuries past. Guards in traditional red uniforms stood at attention, their faces stoic and professional. These were the famous Queen's Guards, the royal guard that had protected British monarchs for generations. Thompson had studied their traditions during his flight across the Atlantic. He knew they were highly trained soldiers beneath those iconic red coats and tall black hats. He respected their dedication and understood the honor associated with their position. What he didn't expect was how their rigid adherence to protocol would soon clash with his own understanding of military courtesy. The palace protocol officer, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and an impeccable British accent, greeted Thompson at the entrance. "General Thompson, welcome to Buckingham Palace. Her Majesty is looking forward to meeting you." The man's tone was warm but formal, setting the stage for what Thompson assumed would be a straightforward diplomatic visit. As they walked through the palace corridors, Thompson marveled at the artwork lining the walls. Portraits of kings and queens gazed down at him, their eyes seeming to follow his movement. Crystal chandeliers hung from ornate ceilings, and thick carpets muffled their footsteps. Everything spoke of tradition, history, and unwavering protocol. The protocol officer explained the schedule for the day. There would be a brief ceremony in the throne room, followed by afternoon tea with several members of the royal family, and then a tour of the palace's military artifacts collection. It seemed straightforward enough, and Thompson felt confident in his ability to represent his country with dignity and honor. What Thompson couldn't have predicted was that his biggest challenge wouldn't come from navigating royal etiquette or making conversation with princes and princesses. Instead, it would come from a seemingly simple interaction with one of the palace guards, a moment that would test everything he thought he knew about respect, tradition, and military protocol. As they approached the throne room, Thompson noticed the royal guard stationed at various points throughout the palace. They stood motionless, their faces hidden beneath the shadows of their distinctive bearskin hats. Their red uniforms were pristine, their posture perfect, and their dedication to their duty was evident in every fiber of their being. Thompson nodded respectfully to each guard they passed, a gesture born from his deep respect for fellow military personnel. Most remained perfectly still, as was their training, but Thompson thought he detected the slightest acknowledgement in their eyes. These were his brothers in arms, soldiers who understood duty, honor, and sacrifice, just as he did. Little did General Thompson know that within the next few hours, his interaction with one of these silent sentinels would create a situation so unexpected, so embarrassing, and so profound that it would change his perspective on leadership, humility, and the true meaning of service. The stage was set for an encounter that would humble one of America's most powerful military leaders in the most unexpected way possible. The throne room ceremony proceeded exactly as planned. General Thompson stood at attention as Her Majesty entered, her presence commanding immediate respect from everyone in the room. The exchange of formal greetings went smoothly, with Thompson presenting the ceremonial gifts and receiving a beautiful commemorative sword in return. Everything was proceeding perfectly according to protocol. After the ceremony, Thompson was given a brief break before afternoon tea. The protocol officer suggested he might enjoy a walk through the palace gardens, famous for their beauty and historical significance. Thompson welcomed the opportunity to stretch his legs and get some fresh air after the formal indoor proceedings. The gardens were even more spectacular than Thompson had imagined. Perfectly trimmed hedges created intricate patterns across the landscape, while colorful flowers bloomed in carefully planned arrangements. Ancient oak trees provided shade along gravel pathways, and ornate fountains added a peaceful soundtrack to the serene environment. As Thompson walked along one of the main pathways, admiring a particularly impressive rose garden, he noticed a royal guard standing at attention near a side entrance to the palace. Unlike the guards inside, this one was completely alone, stationed in what seemed to be a relatively quiet part of the grounds. The guard stood perfectly still, his red uniform brilliant against the green backdrop of the garden. His tall bearskin hat added to his imposing presence, and his rifle was held in the traditional ceremonial position. Thompson had seen hundreds of military personnel at attention throughout his career, but there was something particularly striking about the discipline displayed by this young soldier. Thompson's military instincts kicked in. Throughout his career, he had made it a point to acknowledge and show respect to enlisted personnel, especially those standing guard duty. He believed that respect should flow in all directions within the military hierarchy, and he had never missed an opportunity to show appreciation for soldiers doing their duty. As he approached the guard, Thompson slowed his pace. He could see the young man's face partially shadowed by his hat, but his posture was absolutely perfect. Not a muscle twitched, not a finger moved. The guard's eyes stared straight ahead, focused on some distant point beyond Thompson's shoulder. Thompson stopped directly in front of the guard, maintaining a respectful distance but close enough to speak in a normal tone. He had done this countless times before with American soldiers, offering words of encouragement or simply acknowledging their service. It seemed natural to extend the same courtesy to this British soldier. "Good afternoon, soldier," Thompson said, his voice carrying the authority and warmth that had made him beloved by troops under his command. "Beautiful day for guard duty." The guard's response was absolute silence. Not even the slightest movement indicated that he had heard Thompson speak. His eyes remained fixed on their distant point, his breathing so controlled it was barely perceptible. Thompson waited a moment, thinking perhaps the guard needed time to process the unexpected interaction. He had worked with international forces before and understood that different militaries had different protocols for such situations. "I'm General Thompson from the United States Army," he continued, thinking that perhaps identifying himself might help. "I wanted to thank you for your service and tell you that you're doing an outstanding job here." Again, complete silence. The guard might as well have been a statue carved from stone. Thompson felt a small flush of confusion. In his experience, even the most disciplined soldiers would offer some form of acknowledgement when addressed by a senior officer, especially a foreign dignitary. A slight nod, a brief "yes, sir," or even just eye contact was standard military courtesy across all the armies he had worked with. He tried a different approach, stepping slightly to his left to position himself more directly in the guard's line of sight. "Soldier, I'm speaking to you," Thompson said, his voice taking on a firmer tone that he typically reserved for situations requiring immediate attention. The guard's lack of response was so complete that Thompson began to wonder if there was something wrong. Perhaps the young man was ill, or maybe he hadn't heard properly. Thompson had encountered soldiers who had suffered hearing damage in combat, and he didn't want to assume anything negative about the guard's behavior. "Can you hear me, son?" Thompson asked, genuine concern creeping into his voice. He took another small step closer, now well within what would normally be considered the appropriate distance for a military conversation. What happened next would burn itself into Thompson's memory forever. The guard's eyes suddenly shifted, meeting Thompson's gaze directly for the first time. There was no confusion in those eyes, no illness, no hearing problem. Instead, Thompson saw crystal-clear awareness, complete understanding, and something else that took him a moment to identify: quiet, professional determination. The guard's message was unmistakable, communicated without a single word. He had heard every word Thompson had said. He understood exactly who Thompson was and what he wanted, and he was choosing with absolute deliberation to maintain his duty stance regardless of who was speaking to him. Thompson felt his face grow warm as the realization hit him. This wasn't about disrespect or inability to hear. This was about a level of military discipline that transcended rank, nationality, or personal relationships. The guard was demonstrating something that Thompson, despite all his experience and achievements, had apparently failed to fully understand. General Thompson stood there for several more seconds, processing what had just happened. The guard's eyes had already returned to their forward position, but the brief moment of eye contact had revealed everything Thompson needed to know. This young soldier was not ignoring him out of disrespect or inability to respond. He was following his orders with a level of dedication that Thompson found both impressive and, frankly, irritating. Thompson's initial confusion began transforming into something he hadn't felt in years: embarrassment mixed with growing frustration. Here he was, one of the most senior military officers in the United States, being completely ignored by what appeared to be a relatively junior enlisted man. The rational part of his mind understood that the guard was simply doing his job, but his ego was having a different reaction entirely. "Listen, soldier," Thompson said, his voice taking on the commanding tone that had silenced entire briefing rooms full of colonels and generals. "When a senior officer addresses you, military courtesy requires some form of acknowledgement. I'm not asking you to break protocol, just a simple, 'Yes, sir,' would suffice." The guard remained as motionless as before. If anything, his stillness seemed even more pronounced now, as if he were demonstrating just how perfectly he could maintain his position regardless of external pressures. Thompson felt his jaw tighten. Throughout his career, he had prided himself on being a general who connected with enlisted personnel. He regularly visited troops in the field, ate in mess halls with common soldiers, and made it a point to remember names and personal details about the men and women under his command. This type of interaction, being completely dismissed, was entirely outside his experience. He tried a different approach, thinking perhaps the issue was cultural rather than military. "I understand you have your duties," Thompson said, modulating his voice to sound more conversational and less commanding. "I'm not trying to interfere with your responsibilities. I just wanted to express my admiration for the discipline you and your fellow guards demonstrate. It's impressive, and I wanted you to know that." Still nothing. The guard's breathing remained steady and controlled, his posture unchanged, his gaze fixed on that distant point that seemed infinitely more interesting than the four-star American general standing 3 feet away from him. Thompson glanced around the garden, suddenly aware that his one-sided conversation might be attracting attention. The last thing he wanted was for other palace staff or, worse, members of the royal family to witness him being ignored by a guard. The embarrassment factor was escalating rapidly. A new thought occurred to him. Perhaps this was some kind of test. Maybe the British military was evaluating how foreign dignitaries interacted with their personnel. Thompson had heard stories about various military traditions and initiation practices around the world. Could this be some elaborate way of measuring his patience or cultural sensitivity? "Is this some kind of British military tradition I should know about?" Thompson asked, trying to inject a note of humor into his voice. "Because if it is, you can consider me appropriately impressed by your dedication." The guard's lack of response to this attempt at levity only deepened Thompson's growing sense of frustration. He had tried courtesy, authority, concern, understanding, and humor. Nothing had produced even the slightest reaction from this seemingly immovable young soldier. Thompson took a step back and really looked at the guard for the first time since the encounter began. The young man couldn't be more than 25 years old, but his bearing suggested years of rigorous training, and unwavering commitment to duty. His uniform was absolutely perfect, without a single wrinkle or stain. His rifle was positioned with mathematical precision, and his entire posture radiated professional competence. Despite his frustration, Thompson found himself genuinely impressed by the guard's discipline. In the American military, such rigid adherence to protocol was typically reserved for specific ceremonial occasions or honor guard duties. To maintain this level of formality during what was essentially a casual garden encounter demonstrated a commitment to duty that transcended individual comfort or social expectations. But Thompson's admiration was overshadowed by his growing sense of personal embarrassment. He was a man accustomed to immediate responses when he spoke. Soldiers snapped to attention. Subordinates answered questions promptly, and even foreign military officers showed appropriate deference to his rank and position. This complete dismissal was unlike anything he had experienced in his 30-year career. The sound of footsteps on gravel made Thompson turn around. In the distance, he could see the protocol officer approaching, probably coming to escort him to the afternoon tea session. Thompson realized he had been standing here having a one-sided conversation with an unresponsive guard for nearly 10 minutes. The approaching footsteps gave Thompson a sudden burst of inspiration. When the protocol officer arrived, Thompson could ask about proper procedures for interacting with the Royal Guard. Surely there was some explanation for this behavior, some protocol he wasn't aware of that would clarify the situation and restore his sense of understanding. "General Thompson?" the protocol officer called as he came within speaking distance. "I hope you've enjoyed your walk through the gardens. Are you ready for afternoon tea?" Thompson glanced one more time at the silent guard, who continued to stare straight ahead as if the entire exchange had never happened. The general's frustration had now transformed into something approaching determination. He was not accustomed to unresolved situations, and this encounter was definitely going to require some explanation. "Yes, I'm ready," Thompson replied to the protocol officer, but his mind was already working on how to bring up the topic of Royal Guard protocol without sounding like he had been unable to handle a simple interaction with a junior enlisted man. His reputation as a competent leader was about to face one of its most unexpected challenges. As they walked toward the palace, Thompson couldn't contain his curiosity any longer. The encounter with the guard had left him feeling unsettled and confused, emotions that were foreign to a man accustomed to clarity and decisive action in all military matters. "I hope you don't mind me asking," Thompson began, trying to sound casual, "but I attempted to speak with one of your guards back there, and he didn't respond at all. Is there some protocol I should be aware of regarding interactions with the Royal Guard?" The protocol officer's steps slowed slightly, and Thompson caught a brief flicker of something across his face. Surprise, perhaps, or maybe amusement. "Oh, you tried to speak with one of the guards?" the officer asked, his tone carefully neutral, but with an undertone that Thompson couldn't quite identify. "Yes," the young man stationed near the side entrance. "I simply wanted to acknowledge his service, express some appreciation for his dedication. Standard military courtesy, you understand." Thompson felt the need to justify his actions, though he wasn't entirely sure why. The protocol officer stopped walking entirely and turned to face Thompson directly. "General, may I ask exactly where this guard was positioned? There are several posts around the palace grounds." Thompson pointed back toward the garden area where the encounter had taken place. "Right over there by that stone archway. Young fellow, red uniform, typical guard position. Very disciplined, I must say, though completely unresponsive to conversation." A slow smile spread across the protocol officer's face, and Thompson felt his stomach begin to sink. That smile suggested he was about to learn something that would not reflect well on his understanding of the situation. "General Thompson," the protocol officer said, his voice taking on the tone of someone about to deliver news that was simultaneously amusing and awkward. "I'm afraid I need to clarify something about our Royal Guard protocols." Thompson braced himself, sensing that whatever was coming would not improve his already bruised ego. "The guards you see stationed around the palace grounds are indeed highly trained soldiers, and they do follow extremely strict protocols regarding their duties," the officer continued. However, the specific guard you encountered, the one positioned by the stone archway, well, he's not actually supposed to respond to anyone under any circumstances. I understand that, Thompson replied, feeling slightly defensive. I wasn't asking him to abandon his post or break protocol. I simply wanted to acknowledge his service. The protocol officer's smile widened, and Thompson realized with growing horror that he was missing something significant about the situation. General, the guard at that particular post is under orders to remain absolutely motionless and unresponsive regardless of who approaches him, regardless of what they say, and regardless of how long they persist in trying to get his attention. Thompson felt heat rising in his cheeks. And why is that particular post different from the others? Because, General, that position is specifically designed to test visitors' understanding of British military protocol and their ability to respect boundaries, the protocol officer explained. The guard stationed there is under direct orders to ignore everyone, and I mean everyone, who attempts to engage him in conversation. The full weight of what the officer was saying began to sink in, and Thompson felt his embarrassment deepen exponentially. You see, the officer continued, clearly enjoying this explanation more than Thompson would have preferred. We've found that many foreign dignitaries, especially military officials, feel compelled to interact with our guards. It's natural, really. Military people recognizing military people. But that particular guard is positioned there precisely to demonstrate the absolute nature of duty and protocol. Thompson's mind raced back through his 10-minute encounter with the unresponsive soldier. Every word he had said, every attempt to get the guard's attention, every escalation in tone and approach, all of it had been witnessed by a young man who was under explicit orders to ignore him completely. So when I tried to speak with him, Thompson began, he was doing exactly what he was trained to do, the officer confirmed. In fact, by maintaining his position and ignoring your attempts at conversation, he was demonstrating perfect adherence to his orders. You could have been the Queen herself and his response would have been identical. Thompson felt a wave of humiliation wash over him. Not only had he failed to understand the situation, but he had persisted in trying to get a reaction from someone who was professionally obligated to ignore him. Worse yet, his frustration and growing agitation had probably been evident to the guard, who had remained perfectly composed throughout the entire encounter. Has this happened before? Thompson asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. Oh yes, the protocol officer replied with obvious amusement. We've had generals, admirals, foreign ministers, and even heads of state spend considerable time trying to get that particular guard to respond. Some have become quite frustrated. Others have tried increasingly elaborate approaches. One German general actually started doing jumping jacks in front of the guard to see if he could break his concentration. Thompson closed his eyes briefly, imagining how his own behavior had appeared to anyone who might have been watching from the palace windows. His reputation as a composed, understanding leader was taking a serious hit, and the worst part was that it was entirely self-inflicted. The guard you encountered, the officer added, is actually one of our most experienced men. He's been in that position for 3 years. And he's never broken protocol. Not once. We consider him something of a legend among the royal guard. As they resumed walking toward the palace, Thompson realized that his encounter with the unresponsive guard was about to become much more than just a personal embarrassment. Word of incidents like this had a way of spreading through military circles, and he could already imagine the stories that would emerge about the American general who spent 10 minutes trying to have a conversation with a guard who was specifically trained never to respond. The afternoon tea was held in one of the palace's most elegant rooms, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the same gardens where Thompson's embarrassing encounter had taken place. Crystal glasses caught the afternoon sunlight, and delicate, china cups sat precisely arranged on silver trays. Several members of the royal family were present, along with high-ranking British military officials and diplomats. Thompson tried to focus on the conversations around him, but his mind kept drifting. Back to the silent guard. Every time he glanced toward the windows, he could see the distant figure still standing at attention by the stone archway, as motionless as ever. The knowledge that the guard had been under orders to ignore him made Thompson's persistent attempts to engage him seem even more foolish in retrospect. General Thompson, came a voice from his left. "I understand you've had quite an educational afternoon in our gardens." Thompson turned to see a distinguished British colonel approaching with a barely concealed grin. The man's uniform bore numerous medals and insignia indicating extensive combat experience, but his eyes held the unmistakable glint of someone about to enjoy a bit of good-natured ribbing at Thompson's expense. Colonel Richardson, the protocol officer, had mentioned his name during introductions. "Yes, I've certainly learned something about British military protocol today." "Ah, you met our famous silent sentinel, did you?" Richardson asked, settling into a nearby chair with his teacup. "Wonderful fellow, that guard. Absolutely unflappable. We use him to break in new officers sometimes, see how they handle encountering truly unwavering discipline." Thompson felt his cheeks warm again. "I wasn't aware that the position had such specific requirements." "Oh, most people aren't," Richardson chuckled. "That's rather the point. We've found it's an excellent test of character, actually. Shows us who respects boundaries and who feels entitled to demand attention simply because of their rank." The colonel's words stung more than Thompson cared to admit. Throughout his career, he had prided himself on being a leader who treated all soldiers with respect, but Richardson's observation suggested that his behavior in the garden had demonstrated the opposite. "I hope I didn't come across as disrespectful," Thompson said carefully. "I genuinely wanted to acknowledge the guard's service." "I'm sure you did," Richardson replied, his tone becoming more serious. "But here's the thing, General. That young man's greatest service to the Crown isn't standing at attention or looking impressive in his uniform. His greatest service is demonstrating that duty transcends personal comfort, social expectations, and even the desire to be polite to distinguished visitors." A member of the royal family, Prince Edward, had overheard their conversation and approached their table. "Are we discussing our famous unresponsive guard?" he asked with obvious amusement. "General, you're in excellent company. That particular soldier has confounded some of the most senior military leaders in the world." Thompson managed a weak smile. "So I understand, though I must admit, it's somewhat humbling to realize I completely misunderstood the situation. The first time I encountered him," Prince Edward continued, "I was about 12 years old. I spent 20 minutes trying to make him laugh, smile, or even blink. I tried jokes, funny faces, even stood on my head. Nothing. My grandmother had to explain to me that some duties are so important, they override everything else, including politeness to members of the royal family." The prince's story made Thompson feel slightly better about his own experience, but only marginally. At least Prince Edward had been 12 at the time. Thompson had no such excuse for his behavior. Colonel Richardson leaned forward conspiratorially. "Would you like to know the real test, General? It's not whether someone tries to speak to the guard, that's natural enough. The real test is how they react when he doesn't respond. Do they respect his duty and walk away, or do they keep pushing, trying to force a reaction?" Thompson's stomach dropped. He knew exactly how he had reacted, and it wasn't with the respect and understanding that Richardson was describing as the proper response. "I'm afraid I didn't handle it as well as I should have," Thompson admitted quietly. "Most people don't on their first encounter," Richardson said kindly. "But here's what's interesting. That guard you spoke with has been doing this job for 3 years. Do you know why he's so good at it?" Thompson shook his head, sensing that whatever Richardson was about to tell him would add another layer to his embarrassment. Because before he became a royal guard, he served 2 tours in Afghanistan. He's been under enemy fire, seen his friends wounded, faced life-and-death situations where maintaining discipline literally meant survival. Richardson paused to sip his tea. After experiences like that, standing still while a foreign general tries to make conversation is relatively simple. The weight of Richardson's words hit Thompson hard. The young man he had been trying to command attention from wasn't just some ceremonial guard playing dress-up. He was a combat veteran whose discipline had been forged in the crucible of actual warfare. "His name is Sergeant James Mitchell," Prince Edward added. "He received the Military Cross for his actions in Helmand Province, saved 3 wounded soldiers under heavy fire by maintaining his position and providing cover for a medical evacuation." Thompson felt a profound sense of shame wash over him. He had approached a decorated combat hero and essentially demanded acknowledgement based solely on his own rank and ego. The guard's refusal to respond hadn't been disrespectful. It had been professional in the truest sense of the word. "I think," Thompson said slowly, "I owe that young man an apology." Colonel Richardson and Prince Edward exchanged glances, and Thompson caught the look that passed between them. It was a look that suggested his afternoon of embarrassment was far from over. "Well, General," Prince Edward said with a diplomatic smile, "there might be an opportunity for that. Sergeant Mitchell will be joining us for the evening reception. All the guards who serve during formal visits are traditionally invited to attend the closing ceremonies." Thompson realized that within a few hours, he would be face to face with the guard again, this time in a social setting where conversation would not only be allowed but expected. The prospect of that encounter filled him with a mixture of dread and curiosity about how Sergeant Mitchell would handle meeting the general who had spent 10 minutes trying unsuccessfully to get his attention. The evening reception was held in the palace's grand ballroom, a magnificent space with golden decorations and historical paintings covering every wall. Military personnel from both countries mingled with diplomats and royal family members, creating a blend of formal uniforms and elegant evening wear. Thompson found himself scanning the crowd, looking for the familiar figure of Sergeant Mitchell. When he finally spotted him, Thompson almost didn't recognize the young man. Without his ceremonial red uniform and towering bearskin hat, Mitchell looked remarkably ordinary. A slight build, sandy brown hair, and an unremarkable face that could have belonged to any young professional at a business function. Only his perfect posture and alert eyes hinted at his military background. Thompson watched from across the room as Mitchell engaged in animated conversation with several other guards and palace staff. The man who had stood motionless for hours, ignoring a 4-star general's attempts at conversation, was now laughing at someone's joke and gesturing enthusiastically while telling what appeared to be a story of his own. The contrast was striking and somehow made Thompson's earlier experience even more embarrassing. Mitchell hadn't been unable to respond. He had been professionally unwilling to respond. There was a significant difference between the two, and Thompson was finally beginning to understand it. Colonel Richardson appeared beside Thompson, following, his gaze toward Mitchell. "Quite different when he's off duty, isn't he?" Richardson observed. "Completely," Thompson replied. "It's hard to believe it's the same person." "That's the mark of a truly professional soldier," Richardson explained. "The ability to completely separate personal inclinations from professional requirements. When Sergeant Mitchell is on duty, his personal feelings, his desire to be polite, even his natural human curiosity about meeting foreign dignitaries, none of that matters. Only the mission matters." As if sensing their attention, Mitchell looked across the room and made eye contact with Thompson. For a moment, both men simply looked at each other across the crowded ballroom. Then, to Thompson's surprise, Mitchell smiled and began walking toward them. "General Thompson," Mitchell said as he approached, extending his hand with a genuine smile. "I understand we met earlier this afternoon, though under somewhat different circumstances." Thompson shook the offered hand, noting the firm grip and direct eye contact that contrasted so sharply with their previous encounter. "Sergeant Mitchell, I believe I owe you an apology for this afternoon." Mitchell's smile widened. "No apology necessary, sir. You were simply doing what felt natural to you as a military leader. I was doing what was required of me as a royal guard. Neither of us was wrong, but I kept pushing," Thompson said, feeling the need to acknowledge his behavior. "Even when it was clear you weren't going to respond, I kept trying to force some kind of reaction from you." "With respect, General, that tells me something positive about your character," Mitchell replied, surprising Thompson completely. "It shows that you genuinely care about recognizing the service of enlisted personnel. Most officers in your position wouldn't have bothered trying to acknowledge a simple guard at all." Thompson felt some of his embarrassment begin to fade, replaced by curiosity about this young man's perspective on the afternoon's events. "Can I ask what was going through your mind while I was standing there talking to you?" Thompson asked. Mitchell laughed, a sound that seemed impossible coming from the statue-like figure Thompson had encountered earlier. "Honestly, sir, I was impressed by your persistence. Most people give up after a minute or two. You kept trying different approaches, different tones of voice. It showed creativity and genuine concern. But you never wavered, Thompson observed. Not even for a second. The moment I put on that uniform and take that position, General, I'm not James Mitchell anymore. I'm a symbol of something larger than myself. I represent centuries of tradition, unwavering loyalty, and absolute dedication to duty. Personal conversations, no matter how well-intentioned, simply don't exist in that world. Colonel Richardson had been listening to their exchange with obvious satisfaction. General Thompson, I hope you can see why we're so proud of our Royal Guard. The discipline you witnessed this afternoon isn't just ceremonial. It's the same discipline that served these men well in combat situations around the world. Thompson nodded, finally understanding the full significance of what he had experienced. Sergeant Mitchell, I want you to know that your dedication to duty is genuinely inspiring. I've served with fine soldiers around the world, but the discipline you demonstrated today is exceptional. Thank you, sir, but I hope you understand that it wasn't personal, Mitchell replied. In a different setting, like right now, I'm honored to meet you and speak with you. But when I'm on duty, those distinctions simply don't apply. As the evening progressed, Thompson found himself in several more conversations with Mitchell and other Royal Guards. He learned about their training, their combat experiences, and their perspectives on duty and service. Each conversation deepened his understanding of what he had witnessed that afternoon and his respect for the men who served in these positions. Near the end of the reception, Prince Edward approached Thompson with a small, wrapped package. General, this is a tradition we have for distinguished visitors who have had particularly memorable encounters with our Royal Guard. Thompson opened the package to find a small silver pin depicting a Royal Guard at attention. Attached was a card that read, "In recognition of your persistence and your ultimate understanding of duty above all else, every officer who spent time trying to have a conversation with our unresponsive guards receives one of these." Prince Edward explained with amusement. You're joining a very exclusive club that includes generals, admirals, and heads of state from around the world. Thompson looked across the room at Sergeant Mitchell, who caught his eye and offered a respectful nod. The same kind of acknowledgement Thompson had been seeking in the garden hours earlier. The difference was that now Thompson understood the profound significance of that simple gesture and the professional dedication it represented. As he prepared to leave the palace that evening, Thompson realized that his embarrassing encounter with the Royal Guard had taught him something valuable about leadership, respect, and the true meaning of military discipline. Sometimes the greatest lessons come from the most unexpected sources, and sometimes the most humbling experiences are also the most educational. The silent guard had spoken volumes without saying a word, and Thompson would carry that lesson with him for the rest of his career. 6 months later, back at the Pentagon, General Thompson would find himself telling this story to other senior officers, always emphasizing the profound lesson he had learned about true military discipline. He had framed the silver pin from Buckingham Palace and kept it on his desk as a daily reminder that rank and authority mean nothing without understanding and respect for the principles that guide military service. The story of his encounter with Sergeant Mitchell became something of a legend within military circles, not as an embarrassing failure, but as an example of how even the most experienced leaders can learn from unexpected teachers. Thompson often concluded the story by saying that the guard's silence had taught him more about leadership in 10 minutes than some formal training courses had accomplished in weeks. When young officers would visit his office and notice the unusual pin among his more traditional military decorations, Thompson would smile and tell them about the day a British Royal Guard gave him one of the most important lessons of his military career, without speaking a single word. The pin served as a permanent reminder that true discipline sometimes requires the courage to remain silent, even when breaking that silence would be easier, more comfortable, or seemingly more polite. In the years that followed, Thompson would often reflect on that afternoon in the palace gardens. He came to understand that Sergeant Mitchell's unwavering commitment to his duty, regardless of external pressure or social expectations, represented the very best of military service. The guard hadn't been disrespectful or unprofessional. He had been the embodiment of professional excellence. The experience fundamentally changed how Thompson approached leadership challenges. When faced with difficult decisions that required choosing between popular choices and correct choices, he would remember the young sergeant who stood motionless in the face of pressure from one of America's most senior military leaders. If Mitchell could maintain his principles under such circumstances, Thompson reasoned, then he too could find the strength to do what was right, rather than what was easy. Years later, when Thompson retired from active duty, he made a special trip back to London. He wanted to visit Buckingham Palace one more time and, if possible, see if Sergeant Mitchell was still serving with the Royal Guard. Though Mitchell had moved on to other assignments by then, Thompson stood in the same garden where their memorable encounter had taken place and watched a new generation of guards maintaining the same silent vigil. As he observed the current guard standing at the same post where Mitchell had once demonstrated such remarkable discipline, Thompson felt a deep sense of gratitude for that embarrassing afternoon that had taught him so much. Sometimes the most powerful lessons come from the